Chicago, March 1971. Curtum Studios. The air was thick with cigarette smoke and the weight of unfinished conversations. Outside, the wind carried the scent of Lake Michigan mixed with the exhaust fumes from the Dan Ryan Expressway. Inside the small recording facility on the south side, Curtis Mayfield sat behind the mixing board, his fingers tracing patterns on the console while listening to the playback of "We Gotta Have Peace." The song was raw, urgent, born from the streets of Chicago's South Side, where Curtis had grown up in the Cabrini Green housing projects. It carried the scars of the 1968 riots, the pain of poverty that cut deeper than winter wind, the anger of a community that had been pushed too far for too long. Every note seemed to bleed with the authenticity that came from lived experience, from nights when the sirens never stopped, and mornings when hope felt like a luxury nobody could afford. Curtis had been working since dawn, layering tracks with the methodical precision of someone who understood that music wasn't just entertainment, it was survival. His guitar work was minimal but devastating, each chord placement deliberate, each rhythm section punch calculated to hit listeners somewhere behind their ribs where the real pain lived. This wasn't the polished Motown sound that had made Detroit famous. This was something grittier, more immediate, less concerned with crossing over to white audiences than with speaking truth to power. When the door opened and Marvin Gaye walked in, Curtis didn't look up immediately. He knew why Marvin was there. Word had spread through the tight network of black musicians about Marvin's new direction, about an album called What's Going On that Motown's Berry Gordy didn't want to release. The rumors had been floating around Chicago's music scene for weeks. Marvin Gaye, the smooth prince of romantic soul, was suddenly trying to make protest music. Curtis had heard the whispers at the Checkerboard Lounge, had listened to the skeptical conversations at afternoon sessions on the West Side. Most people thought it was a midlife crisis, a desperate attempt by a fading star to seem relevant in an era when younger artists like Curtis himself were defining what socially conscious soul music could be. Others suspected it was just another calculated move by Motown's marketing machine, an attempt to capitalize on the political consciousness that was sweeping through Black America. Marvin stood in the doorway for a long moment, watching Curtis work. The two men had known each other for years, had crossed paths at countless shows and industry events, had shared stages at the Regal Theater and the Apollo. But there had always been an unspoken tension between them, a divide that went deeper than just musical styles. Curtis represented something that Marvin had never been: authentic struggle, street credibility, a voice that came from the bottom rather than from a carefully constructed image designed to appeal to the broadest possible audience. Marvin's success had always been built on his ability to make women swoon and men feel sophisticated. His voice was silk and honey. His stage presence was calculated seduction. His songs were about pleasure and desire and the sweet complications of romance. He had mastered the art of making pain sound pretty, of turning heartbreak into something that made people want to dance. But in 1971, as America burned with racial tension and the Vietnam War dragged on, and environmental consciousness was just beginning to emerge, pretty wasn't enough anymore. Curtis finally turned around, his eyes meeting Marvin's across the small studio. There was no hostility in his gaze, but there was something harder to stomach: pity. It was the look of someone who had earned his credentials through suffering, looking at someone who seemed to be trying to borrow credibility he hadn't earned. "Heard you're trying to be conscious now," Curtis said, his voice carrying the flat, no-nonsense tone of Chicago's West Side. "That's interesting." The word interesting hung in the air with all the weight of everything it didn't say. Curtis's pronunciation made it clear that he didn't find Marvin's evolution interesting at all. He found it suspect, possibly fraudulent, probably temporary. It was the tone of voice reserved for musicians who chase trends rather than creating them, for artists who confused authenticity with market research. Marvin stepped into the studio, closing the door behind him with more force than necessary. The click of the latch seemed to echo longer than it should have. He had come to Chicago to escape the pressure of Detroit, to get away from Berry Gordy's constant rejections of his new material, to find some space where he could think clearly about what he was trying to accomplish. He hadn't expected to find himself face to face with the one man whose opinion could cut deeper than any record executive's disapproval. "Just writing what I feel," Marvin replied, his voice quieter than usual. Even he could hear how defensive it sounded, how weak and unprepared. He had rehearsed this conversation 100 times in his head during the drive from Detroit, but all his prepared arguments seemed to evaporate under Curtis's skeptical stare. Curtis laughed, but there was no humor in it. It was the kind of laugh that people use when they were too tired for anger, too experienced for surprise. "What you feel? See, that's the problem right there." He stood up slowly, his movements deliberate and unhurried, walking over to a guitar that leaned against the wall. The instrument was scarred and worn, its finish dulled by years of honest use, unlike the pristine guitars that hung in Motown studios. "You've been singing 'How Sweet It Is,' and I heard it through the grapevine? For how long now? 10 years?" Curtis picked up the guitar, running his fingers along the neck without making any sound. 15 years of love songs and dance tracks, making white folks feel good about buying black music. And suddenly you wake up one morning and discover racism exists? The words hit Marvin like physical blows, each one carefully chosen to expose the contradictions in his career trajectory. Curtis wasn't wrong about the timeline. Marvin had indeed spent more than a decade perfecting the art of romantic soul, creating a persona that was safe and appealing and carefully divorced from the political realities of black life in America. He had been groomed by Motown to be palatable, to represent a version of black masculinity that didn't threaten anybody, that made integration seem smooth and inevitable and profitable. But Curtis didn't understand about Frankie, Marvin's younger brother who had come home from Vietnam, broken and traumatized, unable to sleep through the night, jumping at unexpected sounds, telling stories about villages burned and children killed, and orders that made no sense. Curtis didn't know about the phone call that had changed everything. The news that Tammy Terrell was dying, the way that loss had opened up a void in Marvin's chest that nothing seemed able to fill. He didn't know about the nights Marvin had spent staring at the ceiling, wondering what the point was of making pretty music while the world was coming apart. "You don't know what I've experienced," Marvin said, his voice barely above a whisper. It sounded pathetic even to him, the response of someone who knew he couldn't win the argument, but couldn't bring himself to walk away from it. Curtis began picking out the opening notes of "People Get Ready," his fingers finding the familiar pattern automatically. The melody filled the small studio, and with it came the weight of everything Curtis had lived through. He had grown up in Cabrini Green, had seen friends destroyed by drugs and violence, had watched his community burn during the riots of 1968. His political consciousness wasn't something he had discovered in middle age. It was something that had been carved into his bones by necessity, shaped by experiences that began before he was old enough to understand what they meant. "I don't doubt you've experienced things," Curtis said, his voice softer now but still carrying an edge. He continued playing, the guitar lines weaving around his words like smoke. "Rich folks have problems too. Success brings its own kind of suffering, I'm sure. But there's a difference between experiencing something personally and earning the right to speak for people who are living it every day." The distinction cut straight to the heart of Marvin's insecurity about his new direction. He had been struggling with this exact question for months, wondering whether his relatively privileged position within the black community disqualified him from addressing the struggles of people who hadn't been lucky enough to escape poverty and discrimination. He had never been hungry, had never been homeless, had never had to choose between paying rent and feeding his children. His struggles had been psychological rather than material, spiritual rather than physical. Curtis set the guitar aside and walked to the window, looking out at the neighborhood where he had learned about injustice firsthand. "When you were recording 'Let's Get It On,'" he said without turning around, "were you thinking about social justice? When you were singing love songs for white teenagers to buy, collecting royalty checks from Columbia Records? Were you worried about police brutality in Mississippi?" The questions hung in the air like accusations. Marvin stared at the floor, remembering the sessions for those songs, remembering how easily they had come, how natural it had felt to slip into that smooth, seductive persona that had made him famous. He remembered the satisfaction of hearing his songs on the radio, the pride he felt when Berry Gordy praised his commercial instincts, the way success had insulated him from the harsher realities that his music fans were facing every day. But he also remembered other things. The way his father's voice had sounded when he called to tell him about the riots in Detroit, the fear and confusion and barely controlled rage. He remembered watching news footage of protesters being beaten in Selma, feeling helpless and disconnected from his own community's struggle. He remembered the phone call telling him that Tammy Terrell was dying, and the way that loss had opened up a void in his chest that nothing seemed able to fill. He remembered his brother Frankie coming home from Vietnam, broken and traumatized, unable to explain what had happened to him over there, but unable to forget it either. "You think I don't have the right to grow?" Marvin asked, finally looking up. His voice carried a note of desperation that surprised both of them. "You think once you choose a path, that's it forever? No evolution, no learning, no changing your mind about what matters?" Curtis turned away from the window, studying Marvin's face with new attention. This wasn't the smooth, confident entertainer he had expected to encounter. This was someone genuinely struggling with questions that didn't have easy answers. Someone who seemed to be wrestling with his own conscience in real time. "Show me," Curtis said simply, his tone shifting from accusation to challenge. He gestured toward the piano in the corner of the studio. It was an old upright, its wood scarred by years of use, its keys yellowed with age and cigarette smoke. To Marvin, it looked like an altar where he would either prove himself or be exposed as a pretender, where his new songs would either stand up to scrutiny or crumble under the weight of their own contradictions. Marvin walked to the piano and sat down, his movements careful and deliberate. The bench was lower than he was used to, forcing him to adjust his posture, to find a new relationship with the instrument. His hands found the keys without conscious thought, muscle memory taking over where his mind felt frozen. He began with a simple chord progression, nothing fancy, just the foundation of something that had been growing in his head for weeks. The first notes of what would become inner city blues filled the studio. It wasn't finished yet, wasn't polished or arranged or ready for public consumption. But the essence was there. A groove that felt like walking through a broken neighborhood at midnight, a melody that carried the weight of unpaid bills and limited options and dreams deferred. The rhythm section was just in his imagination, but he could hear how it would sound when it was finished, the way the drums would hit like heartbeats under pressure, the way the bass would anchor everything to the ground. Marvin began to sing, his voice raw and unprocessed, no studio tricks or background vocals to smooth the edges. The lyrics were fragments, images that had been accumulating in his mind since his brother came home from war. Triggers, inflation, unemployment, no chance to increase finance. Bills pile up, sky high, send that boy off to die. The words tumbled out not as a polished statement, but as a confession, an admission that he was just beginning to understand the complexity of the world he was trying to address. Curtis listened without moving, his expression unreadable. When Marvin finished the first verse and moved into what would become the bridge, Curtis's eyebrows raised slightly. The musical sophistication was undeniable, even in this rough form. The way Marvin had woven together jazz harmonies with a funk groove, the way his vocal melody danced around the beat rather than sitting squarely on top of it, the way the lyrics managed to be both specific and universal. This wasn't the work of someone trying to cash in on a trend. This was the work of someone who had found something real to say and was learning how to say it. Without stopping, Marvin segued into another song, this one even less finished. The melody was haunting, almost spiritual, built around a chord progression that seemed to breathe with its own life. But the lyrics were about environmental destruction, about the connections between industrial pollution and social decay. "Poison is the wind that blows from the north and south and east," he sang, his voice breaking slightly on the word poison. "Mercy, mercy me. Things ain't what they used to be. Where did all the blue skies go?" This would become Mercy, Mercy Me, though at this moment it existed only as fragments held together by Marvin's intuitive understanding of how pain could be transformed into beauty. Curtis could hear the finished arrangement in his head, could imagine how the strings would swell, and the horns would punctuate, and the rhythm section would support without overwhelming. But even in this skeletal form, the song's power was unmistakable. When Marvin finally stopped playing, The silence in the studio felt heavy with possibility and judgment. Curtis remained motionless for a long moment, processing what he had just heard. The music was unlike anything in Marvin's previous catalog, but it was also unlike anything Curtis had expected from him. There was a sophistication to the arrangements that went beyond anything Curtis himself had attempted, but there was also an emotional honesty that couldn't be faked. "That's not protest music," Curtis said finally, his voice carrying a note of surprise. Marvin's heart sank. He had exposed himself, had shared something deeply personal and incomplete, and Curtis was rejecting it. All his fears about authenticity and credibility came rushing back, along with Berry Gordy's voice in his head, telling him that political music wouldn't sell, that he was throwing away his career for a moment of misguided idealism. But then Curtis continued, "That's something else entirely. That's prophecy." The word hung in the air between them like a benediction. Marvin looked up, searching Curtis's face for any sign of sarcasm or mockery. Instead, he found something he hadn't expected: respect, mixed with a kind of wonder that seemed almost childlike in its honesty. "Most of us," Curtis said slowly, walking back toward the piano, "we write about what we see around us. The immediate struggle, the obvious injustice, police brutality, poverty, discrimination. We document the symptoms." He paused, his hand resting on the piano's worn wood. "You're writing about the disease itself. You're connecting dots that most people don't even know exist yet." Curtis sat down on the edge of the piano bench, facing Marvin. "When you sang about poison in the wind, you weren't just talking about air pollution. You were talking about how everything is connected, how the same system that sends kids to Vietnam is the same system that's destroying the earth, that's keeping people trapped in cycles they can't escape. That's not something you learn from living in the projects. That's something you see from having a different kind of perspective, from being able to step back and see the whole picture instead of just one piece of it."